Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. Yes, I'm going to be scientifically ruining the interfaces in children's shows. Don't worry if you've never seen a children's show. This is an all-encompassing talk for everyone. You're not going to be excluded. Now, 10 years ago, I was at Electromagnetic Field in 2016 doing a talk on scientifically ruining the computer interfaces in movies and TV. I've included this graphic because during the streaming and recording and playback of this, I want the screen to look very confusing with a photo of present me and past me on it at the same time. And I'll see you again in 2036 when I try and do the same again. But since 2016, a lot has changed. In 2016, 16 gigabytes of RAM would cost you around 60 quid. In 2026, it will cost you your firstborn child. In 2016, AI was, to many people, just a kind of cool film. In 2026, it's a dystopian nightmare sapping the universe and the earth of natural and creative resources. But at least it can make you write emails quicker. In 2016, our Prime Minister was David Cameron, and now it's now it's Boris, no. Now it's Liz, no. Now it's no. Now it's Rishi, no. Now it's Kirst, no. It's Andy Burnham, Count Binface, who knows? A lot has changed since 2016. For me personally, a lot has changed too. In 2016, I was leading the type of life where I could go to vineyards and drink sparkling wine whenever I wanted to. Since then, in 2026, I now have 2 children, and my life is very different. So instead of going out and watching primetime TV shows and acclaimed films, I'm living in CBeebies and Disney these days. Now, normally I would introduce myself by saying the following. I'm Dr. Sarah Wiseman. I have a PhD in human-computer interaction. I'm a lecturer. I was a lecturer of interaction design and escape rooms, amongst other things. I'm now a consultant user researcher. I was a prize finalist for the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society, and I've been quoted in mainstream media on many different topics around number entry. However, none of that matters, because my title now is Mum. And according to my children, one of whom is here today, hi. According to my children, my achievements are as following. I quite often peel bananas catastrophically wrongly. I do children's shoes up too tightly. I'm quite mean about when the TV needs to be turned off. I do children's shoes up too loosely. I sometimes try to sing in the car, and I sometimes think about singing in the car. You may notice this is more a list of crimes than it is achievements, but that's who I am today. So, as I said, my life is looking a bit different. So I thought during this talk today, instead of scientifically approaching interfaces in movies and TV shows, we would apply the same principles and learn a bit more about HCI, human-computer interaction, through the lens of children's shows, because that's quite frankly all I've got these days. Now, the first show we're going to look at, I do feel a bit guilty about, because it's Hey Dougie, and that is a show that, I'm unsurprised by that. Hey Dougie's actually an okay show, okay? If you have to be trapped watching a TV show for children, Hey Dougie, you could do a lot worse. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the future episode, and in this episode, Dougie and the 5-year-olds he looks after, who still take naps somehow, are going to imagine what it's like in the future. We are going to see the character Happy, who is a crocodile, interacting in a kind of Minority Report style with a hovering interface, and he's going to be making his own hybrid seed. He's going to be choosing lots of different elements from lots of different plants to make a hybrid seed that will grow into who knows what. In the future, they obviously have bigger concerns than maintaining natural biodiversity. But let's have a look at that clip now.
What can we plant, Dougie? Anything? I'll plant a bit of sweet corn, strawberry, big pink flowers, and a bit of this, and some of that, and this, and and that. Yeah.
The suspense. What does it grow into? I'm not going to tell you. You're just going to have to go away and suffer that. Watch that yourself and find out. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is not the minority style report style interface, which actually is ergonomically horrendous. When you have to have your arm out in front of you, that's called static load, and there's only a short amount of time you can do that without resting on something before your arm starts to hurt really, really quickly. Whilst I was writing this talk, interestingly, I Googled that, and it's actually sometimes referred to as gorilla arm, which is a term I have never, ever heard. So I now have a side quest to work out how on earth that has a Wikipedia entry. But that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the interface and something called the information architecture. Information architecture is the design of how information is displayed to a user on a website, on an interface, on a festival badge that you might be wearing around your neck now. Information architecture is the way that you arrange that information so that the user of that interface can more easily navigate it and understand what they're doing and find things. Now, when information architecture is designed well, you are likely not even noticing it because you're thinking, well, it's obvious how this should be arranged. But actually, it's not. Information architecture can be done really badly, and in that case, it's very frustrating. Have you ever been at the supermarket trying to work out if the tomato you're holding goes into fruit or vegetable or salad on the self-checkout machine? You'll know that information architecture can be done badly. And I'm telling you that an information architect has been nowhere near that interface that Happy just had to interact with. And here's why I'm going to tell you that. That's because it doesn't adhere to a certain principle. Now, the person who coined the term information architecture also coined this term, LATCH. For any breastfeeding parents in the audience, don't worry, it's not that type of latch. Let's break it down into the acronym. It stands for location, alphabet, time, category, and hierarchy. And these basically describe the 5 ways that you might want to arrange information. There's no real other ways you might want to do it. So let's break those down and see what they involve. So, location. If, like me, you are in your late 30s and you have a very unhealthy relationship with Rightmove, and scanning people's floor plans, then you have seen information arranged in a location-based way. When you type into Rightmove the postcode of your fictional new house, it displays those houses to you in a location-based order. It's very useful like that. Now, alphabetical. This one's a little bit different. It's when you arrange information by alphabetizing it. A good example of this, you are on an all-company Teams call, and you don't like the speaker. So you are scanning the participant list to see if your work wife or work husband is also on the call so that you can get into Slack and back-channel chat about that speaker. Just me? Maybe just me. Okay, don't tell my work. Now, that participant list in a Teams call is arranged by alphabet. If that used the location-based information architecture and it arranged all the participants on that call based on how close they were to you, A, that would be a GDPR nightmare and I think a big leak, and B, it would not be very useful. It's more useful to be able to see people according to alphabet. Time, when information should be displayed through temporal means. Now, again, I've said I'm in my late 30s, and so the social media of choice for me is obviously Strava. I love to see my friends, heavy lifting queens, getting in their reps and improving their bone density. Kudos for everyone, yes. Now, Strava arranges its information architecture according to time. The most recent workout you see is the one that is most prominent in the Strava interface. Now, category. This is when information is arranged by nominal categories, where you need to arrange it by the names of things. So you might want to arrange something by sets of colors, or if you were doing like body parts, you might say, here's a group of noses that we have, and here's a group of eyes that we have, and here's a group of eyebrows that we have, and hang on. Here's some mouths and some glasses and some other things. Okay, we've made the me structure. We'll just get to the drop and then we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, next. You get the idea. That's how category works. Now, hierarchy. Hierarchy is when you need to structure information when it has a natural kind of parent and child interaction with one another. And the thing I'm going to use here is Bluey, because I had to put it in the talk somewhere. So if we were going to arrange maybe a website that would allow you to navigate through the Bluey family, you'd do it like this probably. You'd have Nana Christine and Grandpa Mort at the top, And then under Nana Christine, you'd obviously have Rad, Stripe, and Bandit. And under Mort, you'd have Chili and Brandy. And then under Stripe, you'd have Muffin, yes, Queen, and Socks. Then under Bandit, you'd have Bluey and Bingo. And then Bluey and Bingo can also belong to Chili, though. And then, obviously, in the episode The Sign, we see Brandy turning out pregnant, don't we? So there's obviously another child there. And then when we think about the episode The Surprise, we know that Bluey has a child, so that would go there. But then that raises the question of who is Bluey's child's father? Is it Jean-Luc? Is it Mackenzie? I don't know who we would put in this location. Okay, I've lost myself a bit there, I'm sorry. I know I've lost most of the tent as well. But I also know that there's a small proportion of the tent sitting in front of me who's nodding along with me, who has some deep Bluey fan theory, who want to talk to me about this after the talk for real life, and I respect that. Anyway, let's get back to the information architecture. What this also helpfully shows is the idea of polyhierarchical classification. That is, some information can belong in two different groups. Bingo and Bluey belong to both Bandit and Chili. And that's not a problem. That shows that you are reflecting the possible mental models that your users might have. Okay, those are the 5 ways that you can possibly arrange our information in information architecture. I will say, whilst I was doing this, I realized that the information within the LATCH acronym is not arranged according to any of those rules. It's arranged according to a secret 6th category that is whimsy, I think. But you get the gist. So let's go back to our source material, and let's try and help this poor crocodile child to navigate this interface. So we know from the clip that there is possible seeds that he can choose that are fruit and veg, and we know that there's also a flower option. What I'm seeing here is categories. So, excuse the graphic design. You haven't come to a graphic design talk, okay, so bear with me. What we're going to do is we're going to put something over this side, this is the things that a plant produces, and we're going to split that up into vegetables and fruit. And then we're going to further use a different information architecture strategy to arrange those. We're going to put those in alphabetical order. So we've got the vegetables going down the side, the fruit going across the top. You'll notice I've not included tomato because I don't want to get into it. On the other side, what we're going to put is we're going to put the flowers. Now the flowers we're going to separate out by category, so we'll do colors of flowers that you can choose. And then we're going to talk about the number of petals that you can have. So we'll put that on the right-hand side, and obviously we'll arrange the numbers alphabetically. Okay, fine. We'll do the numbers in numerical order. Let's not do any innovation. Now, I think what we've got here is a more easily navigable interface that will require fewer absolute buttons for pink flower with 2 petals. And it's something that you can maybe hopefully approach without having touched before and understand how to navigate. And we've done that by using the latch method rather than the smash it all over the screen method. Now, that was Dougie. What I want to do now is talk about Disney, because I'm in the mood to poke something big and American with a stick. What we're going to talk about is Mickey's Clubhouse. Mickey's Clubhouse is a TV show where Mickey and his friends live in a colorful clubhouse and go on adventures with lots of sound effects. One of the features of this show is that Mickey appears to be suffering from quite crippling self-anxiety. He regularly needs to check in with the audience about whether something is right or not. Hey kids, was that orange purple? Tell me, can you remember? Mickey, mate, trust your gut. You don't need to ask us. You know the answer. You don't need to check in with us. The thing that we're going to see here is an incident where Mickey has realized he hasn't got a Valentine's Day card for Minnie, and he needs to make one. So he needs to find the arts and crafts room. Let's see how he does that.
Let's call up the arts and crafts area, okay? Does that look like the arts and crafts area?
No, Mickey, no.
No, that's the kitchen. Is that the arts and crafts area?
No, Mickey, no, it's not.
Nah, that's the bathroom. Is that the arts and crafts area?
Yeah.
You betcha! Come on, everybody, let's go make Minnie's Valentine's Day card.
Okay, so firstly, that's some really impressive architecture, isn't it? That was plumbing spinning, right? The kitchen and the bathroom were both on a spinning axis. Most people would say that's ridiculous, but we know in this universe there is at least one plumber who, when a billionaire mouse called him, said, yes, I can make rotating plumbing for you. Another thing is that the maths of that is quite interesting, isn't it? Like each room was 180 degrees, and we saw 4 rooms, so that's a circle with 720 degrees in it. I think that is the real multi-dimensional stuff that Disney needs to investigate. Forget the multiverse. Now, what I want to talk about is, let's look at the way that that information was organized, the way that those rooms were ordered, because I think there's something that we can talk about there. The number of lever pulls that those things take. The first one was the living room. That took no lever pulls. Number 1 was the kitchen. After 2 lever pulls was the bathroom, and then after 3 lever pulls, we got to the craft room. Now, I think this hasn't been done very well because of all the rooms, that should be 2 very slow lever pulls away. I don't think the bathroom is it. I think if you're pretty desperate for a wee, you don't want to have to pull that lever 2 times and wait. And I think, therefore, there's a very high chance that Mickey Mouse has, at one point when coming back from the pub and needing a wee, urinated in that fish tank. And I can prove it. So, what we're talking about here is the way that information is organized in a closed space and how we navigate through multiple layers of information in a kind of one-dimensional way. This is less kind of cryptically illustrated by your phone. So on your phone, when you go to open a text or an email and you write, you'll be given the uppercase keys on the keyboard. Then when you type an uppercase key, it becomes lowercase, but you could do it by pressing the shift key. If you wanted to turn those lowercase keys into uppercase keys, you'd have to press the shift key again. Now, if you're on an iPhone and you want to press a number, then you're going to have to press the number button, so that's another number press. And then that gets you a few of the symbols, but if there are other symbols you want to press, then you want to do a tilde, did you say? A tilde? Why would anyone need a tilde? Oh, you want to talk about a hacking and crafting festival that happens every other year? Okay, I understand. We'll find the tilde for you, but I've got bad news. It's going to involve one more key press. There's a lot of things you have to do to navigate the information there, and it's not any different to pulling that lever like Mickey was doing, but we're using a soulless touchscreen button instead. Now, the problem with this is that that involves a lot of effort. You might not think it does, it's just pressing an extra button every now and then. But researchers have found that if you want to computationally model the way that people think about navigating a keyboard like that, you actually have to include the cognitive time it takes to think about it. That's both the time it takes to think, where on earth is that symbol? Is it in the first layer or is it in the second layer of symbols? You also need to include the amount of time it takes for people to make a mistake. Just because you think you've remembered where it is and you've pressed that symbol button 2 times, you might overshoot and then have to go all the way right back again. And in the end, this process takes a lot more effort, and it's actually very onerous to have to navigate a text keyboard when you want those symbols at the back. Now, it's so onerous that people are willing to make bad decisions. Other researchers have done a test on how people design passwords depending on the device they're given. They gave one set of participants a physical keyboard, they gave another set of participants a touchscreen phone, and they asked these participants to design new passwords on them. And as a result of the device that they were using, there were some significant differences. The participants that were given the phone keyboard to create passwords on were significantly more likely to choose passwords that had lowercase letters in them than those who had physical keyboards, who were more likely to include symbols and uppercase and numerical information in their password. When they then did a further test on the passwords that were created, there was a significant difference in the crackability of the passwords created by those 2 participant groups. So people, when given a phone keyboard to design a password on, find it so much of a faff to use that keyboard that they are willing to make unsecure decisions and be significantly less safe. And what I'm saying is, if when it comes to security, we are not even willing to press a little button on a phone screen to get to the deeper levels of information, Mickey has definitely not been bothered to pull that lever and has weed in that fish tank. Now, my next interface, okay. So, I had to put a wash on, and then I had to prepare dinner, and then I had to pack for this camping festival I'm going on with my kid, and I don't actually have another interface to show you today. But I know they're out there. I have watched hundreds of thousands of hours of TV shows for kids, and I know there are other terrible interfaces out there. So, I am at Wisemakes on Threads, and I don't post much, but if you ever find yourself trapped in a room with a children's TV show, and you see an interface that you don't really rate, then send it to me, and we can make fun of Mickey behind his back. Thank you very much.